Hello, everybody, and welcome to CUGH's training webinar, How to Engage Congress. I'm Keith Martin, Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health based here in Washington, D.C. Now, wherever you live, it is critically important that those of us who are involved in global health and development, who are committed to improving the lives of people and addressing our environmental challenges, that we engage with politics, that we engage with policymakers. Now, we have our own way of communicating, our own language, our own incentives, our own way of engaging. Politicians have their own way of doing this. They have their own language, own incentives, own way of getting and acquiring knowledge, acquiring information, and using it. That gap exists, and it needs to be bridged. So how do we do it? Well, today I'm very pleased to introduce Stephanie Vance. Stephanie is the founder of Advocacy Associates. She has more than a two and a half decade experience on Capitol Hill, on engaging with congresspersons, and she's known as the Advocacy Guru. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, who's going to present you with how to deal with some of the challenges I mentioned, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And before I go, I just want to advise everybody in the US to make sure that you exercise your right to vote. Please vote up and down the ballot in the November elections and vote like your life depends on it, because it does. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Stephanie. Stephanie, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. And yes, I am indeed Stephanie Vance, and I am known as the Advocacy Guru, which is a title I kind of made up. But basically, it comes from my experiences here in Washington, D.C. I've been here, as Dr. Martin mentioned, for quite a long time, and have worked as a legislative aide. I've worked as a lobbyist. I've worked as a grassroots network development consultant, and now I'm here to share with you some of the thoughts that I have on how to be effective advocates. And I tell you all that so you know that how I come to this perspective. And basically, I am sharing with you the thoughts that elected officials and their staff have when they are confronted with people who are communicating messages with them. And my goal here really is to make sure that you're as effective as possible. Now, before I get too far into it, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. So if you can hear the sound of my voice, hit the raise your hand button on your screen. It's a little button that looks like a hand. All right, we got hands going up. You can raise your hand where you are, but I won't be able to see you. But all right, looks like everyone can hear. And I also want to go through a couple housekeeping things. First of all, everyone has joined in a mute-only mode. And what that means is you could talk all you wanted and I could not hear you. And the reason why we do this is to mitigate any background noise. If you have questions, you should see a question box. It's a little gray box with the word questions on it. And if you're not seeing that, you should see a white arrow on a red background that will open up the toolbox that you can use to type in your questions. So type in your questions there. You can ask the questions as you go along. We'll be saving some time at the end to address those. You can also send messages along in the chat box. You should see something that says chat with the gray arrow or white arrow. And one of the first questions I always get is, will this be recorded? And the answer is yes, this will be recorded, so you can enjoy it over and over and over again. Share with your friends and family. So without further ado, I'm not seeing any questions. We sometimes have some audio issues, so bear with us as that happens. As you know, most of the world is now using this format to communicate. So if you have any ongoing problems, the audio drops out for you, the video drops out for you, do try logging back in. That sometimes helps. And without further ado, let's get started on our advocacy program. So the way I'm going to present this is to talk about 4 key elements of effective advocacy, and they are knowing what you want, knowing who you're talking to, knowing how to talk to them, and knowing how to follow up. And whether you're actually going to be speaking with legislators during your Hill Day, or if you're just going to be communicating with legislators throughout the year, these key elements are essential to getting your message across in a way that makes legislators really sit up and listen. So let's go through these. First of all is knowing what you want. And And what I mean by that is to make a specific ask. What you need to do when you're talking to the legislators is to understand what the problem is, or make sure they understand what the problem is, and to have them think of that problem in the form of a solution. Make sure you're presenting a solution and put that in the form of a question. Now, some of you know that when you talk with elected officials, usually, you might go in and they'll say things like, I love the work you do. It's so wonderful. Thank you for, helping us, and, for your scientific acumen and blah, blah, blah. And they don't ever really do what it is you might be asking them to do. And sometimes that's because it's not specifically in the form of a question. A question switches the little switch in their head that says, hey, they're asking me a question. I better pay attention to what they're saying. For those in the academic community, it's kind of like, as you know, when you're teaching, if you're doing a test or if you're in a discussion group, you're going to get people going on the conversation by asking a specific question. Now, your team will have your very specific asks for those who are doing the calls next week, but these asks can apply throughout the year. You can always talk to your team about what the specific asks are coming up. And you can make what I call some relationship building asks. So those aren't necessarily the policy asks, like, will you co-sponsor this particular bill? But they are relationship building asks like, hey, can we do a video site visit? And I'll talk about those in a little more near the end. But can we do a video site visit? Would you like to come and visit one of our classes? Things that are questions that they have to think about whether they're going to say yes or no to, but they're not necessarily a policy specific ask. And those relationship building questions can really help you develop a long-term relationship with your legislators so that when you do come to them with a policy ask, they're more likely to agree with you. So for example, one of the current questions that you'll be talking about, or current questions that you have with Congress, might be to vote yes on HR 6763 or S 3721. Which have to do with setting up a task force for racial and ethnic disparities regarding COVID. And that is a really critical thing. You want to get your legislators to vote yes on that. And instead of saying, hey, this is important, we hope you support this bill, you would ask, will you support this bill? And again, that's because it actually forces them to think about it when it's in the form of a question. So making the ask, knowing what you want, is really important. And I'm just going to double check to see if we have any questions on making the ask while we move on. Okay, I had a question about the name of those bills again. So we'll have the materials for you afterwards. There's a couple different asks, and I don't want to have you have to scribble all those names down. So you'll get that material from your team afterwards. But I just wanted to use that as an example. And then I had another question when it comes to making the ask about, does your political audience expect you to be an expert on the background surrounding your question? That is an excellent, excellent question, and I get a lot of people who are asking that. The good news is no, they do not. If they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, the answer is, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. There's not going to be any civics quiz or, question on what the appropriations were since the beginning of time. If you have looked at the materials that your team is giving you, which is a one-pager, you'll be able to ask the question in a way that makes sense to them. So, for example, if you're asking to establish a racial and ethnic disparities task force looking at COVID, you can simply ask for that. And then if they say, well, what's the specific numbers of whatever, or something that you don't know, all you need to do is say, I don't know, and I'll get back to you. But they certainly don't expect you to be an expert on that policy asks. What they do expect you to be an expert on is what you're already an expert on, which is how the work you do might impact public policy, or how it might impact how we address COVID in the country, or climate change, or whatever issue it is that you work on. All right, so let's go on to step number 2, which is knowing who you're talking to. So you figured out what you want, and you've put that in the form of a question. Now you're going to figure out who it is you're talking to, and what you want to know about them is what gets them up in the morning and what keeps them up at night. And every legislator has a different thing that gets them up in the morning. That is an issue that they have come to Congress to work on. It is something that they've talked about through all their campaign. They've talked about it as an important priority. And sometimes it's not what you think is a priority. So part of your job is to figure out what that priority is for them, and then to frame your message in a way that captures their attention. So you may have some, if we're talking about the current COVID situation, yes, you may have some legislators for whom healthcare is the biggest priority. But you also might have some legislators who might be more interested in technology issues, or who might be more interested in, let's say, small business issues. Doesn't mean they're not working on COVID, doesn't mean they're not thinking about it. But if you know they're interested in small business issues, you might want to approach some of your COVID asks from that perspective. So you might say, this COVID pandemic, as you know, has had a big impact on small businesses. And we're finding that some of the best ways to try and address the pandemic are such and such and such and such, whatever, kinds of information you have. And then, you might, if you're going to talk about the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force, and I keep using that as an example just because it's an easy example to talk about. But you might say, okay, one of the things that we want to do to help, small businesses, particularly in racial and, ethnic diversity, minority areas, is to set up this task force. So you can see sort of how you might tie that thing that they care about over to the thing that you want to talk about. Now, if you feel like the thing that they care about that gets them up in the morning isn't something that you can really relate to your asks, you don't want to make it, you don't want to try and tie it in too convoluted a way. But for the most part, many of the things that you're talking about can be tied to the things that the legislators are interested in. And then what keeps them up at night? Now, as we know, this time period, everyone's being kept up at night by re-election. This is not something that you should talk about with your legislators during any phone calls, especially any that are policy specific. You do want to sort of think about that, though. That's at the back of their mind. Excuse me. So what keeps them up at night? One nice thing to know about that sort of election situation is how close the election is in that particular legislator's district or in the state. And the reason why that's valuable is because it helps you understand a little bit more about what they are focused on in terms of constituent service. So someone who's has a very close election is going to be focusing much more on the specific needs of their constituency, whereas someone who's not in a close election might have more flexibility to work on a broader agenda that impacts not just the entire state, but the entire country. Now, I know you're wondering, well, how do we find that information? There's a couple ways. So the key things, the details, the most important things to understand about the legislators that relate to that, know what gets them up in the morning and keeps them up at night, are their committee assignments, where they are in the political spectrum, and their policy interests. So their committee assignments will tell you a lot about either their district or how they see the world or what they work on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, if you are talking to a member of Congress and you see that he or she is on the Agriculture Committee, that probably tells you that they're very interested in rural issues, and they may represent a very rural area. So in that case, you might talk about, how the impacts of COVID in these rural communities, the difficulties of access to care, testing, and how testing might, impact rural communities. Again, racial and ethnic disparities in rural communities. But you'll know, okay, they're agriculture, they care about that. As I mentioned, they might be on a small business committee. Oh, okay, they care about that. They might be on the Veterans Committee, in which case, oh, okay, I'm going to focus on veterans issues. And if you can't connect those issues, don't feel like you have to. It's just a great way to sort of understand how they see the world. Also, their policy interests. And again, those are the things that keep them up wake them up in the morning. And their policy interest is usually pretty easy to figure out. You can go to their websites, and those are house.gov and senate.gov for the U.S. federal government. For the state government, you'll have your own state legislative websites. And for my friends in the international community who are on the call, these same principles will also apply in your own governmental systems. It's basically called knowing the audience. So their policy interest, you would go to their websites and you would look up, usually they have a tab that says issues or legislation or something that tells you this is where I, member of Congress, am going to relay all of the information about what issues I care about. You can also take a look at their press releases. Often that has information about the things that they're working on. You can also look up bills that they have introduced. And there's a great website, congress.gov. And let's see if I can show you that. So you go to www.congress.gov. And again, this is from my friends in the domestic community, in the US community, but if there are others, the same kind of principle will apply. And you would go, hopefully you would know your member of Congress, but if you don't, you have a very easy way to look it up. And you would scroll down and you could find your own representative. So I'm going to use a member of Congress that I worked for in the past, Congressman Earl Blumenauer. And so you see, you get this information about the congressperson, but you also can scroll down and get information about legislation he has sponsored or that has been co-sponsored by him. Now, I strongly suggest that you look only at sponsored legislation because that's what the legislator, him or herself, has introduced. And then, you want to narrow it down. I would say look at just the 116th Congress, our current Congress, because that will help you narrow it down. He introduces a lot of legislation, so 64 bills. But you can see here some of the things that he's interested. He's been very interested in responses to the pandemic. He's interested in cannabis-related legislation. He has some interest in tax loopholes. As you read through this, he's got interest in environmental issues. So he tends to be interested in a lot of different issues. So you have the advantage of relaying a lot of information, of being able to tie your perspectives to a lot of different issues with him. Another great website is vote.org. And this, this is the registration for, this is for voter registration, which of course you all should be, you all should be engaged with, but actually the one I was looking for is votesmart.org. Apologies for that. And this is a great website for looking up the biographies of legislators, their votes that they've taken, some of the positions on issues, and often most important, their speeches that they've made recently on issues. So, for example, you could look at a specific legislator. Let's see if we can find a legislator's name. We'll use Earl again. And we find him. And then we can look at his biographical information, and it will pull this up. One of the things I like to look at is the ratings information. So when you pull up the ratings information, it gives you ratings from every issue under the sun. So many groups do a huge number of issues, or huge number of issues are rated by different organizations. So for example, you'll see that he's received a ranking of 78% by the American Council of Engineering Companies. Not only is it interesting to see how many groups do these kinds of scorecards, but it also, again, gives you a good idea of how he tends to vote on different kinds of issues. And for those who are trying to frantically write all this down, have no fear. All of this is being recorded and you will get the materials after the session. I just wanted to give you an idea about how you might do some of this research because I know you guys are research people, so hopefully that helps. So that's their committee assignments and their policy interests. You'd also want to know where they are on the political spectrum. And this is important because not because I think that Democrats should talk only to Democrats or that Republicans should talk only to Republicans, but it does help you understand how they see the world. So a more conservative member might be looking more at cost savings and the benefits of job development and small business development. They might be more on that side of the spectrum. Whereas if you're talking with a more liberal member, you might have a lot of questions. They might be more concerned about economic disparities and that sort of thing. So just knowing that when you go in lets you know where you can start your argument. because you're probably not going to want to start your argument with a very liberal sort of perspective in a more conservative office. And I don't mean you don't make your asks and you don't focus on those. It's just that if you tweak your messages a little bit, you'll be able to really capture their attention. All right, so that's knowing what you want and who you're talking to. And I'm just going to check in here on any questions we have, because I know we've had some coming in, and I want to make sure that we make sure we're addressing those. So I'm going to scroll up. We do have a number of questions, and it's always good to try and address these as we go along. Let's see. So we addressed that. Does your political audience expect you to be an expert? Let's see. Will you support this bill be specific enough? They might say they'll support it when it gets to the floor, but they won't help it get to the Senate. That is a great question. Your asks will be specific to what your team is telling you, because they're focusing on it where it is in Washington, D.C., where it is in the legislative process right now. But so, for example, this Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force Act would be vote yes on these specific bills that are outlined. And again, that material will be available to you. But vote yes on these specific on these specific bills. Now, when I say, will you support the bill, the ask there might be, will you co-sponsor this bill? Or will you talk to your other legislators about this bill? That's the kind, you will have a specific ask. I'm using, will you support this bill as sort of more of a generic asks. But great question, you do want to be specific. So another question for who we are talking to, would you only look for legislators who have a stake in the issue to ask for support? That is another great question. In our representative democracy in Washington, D.C., the best people to focus on are the legislators who represent you. So, you could reach out to other legislators who might be on key committees or who might be in the leadership of an organization. But if you aren't their constituent, they probably aren't going to pay much attention to you. And I hate to sort of put it that barefaced, but that is indeed the case. If you're not a constituent, or you can't sort of connect to a constituent, if you can't explain a constituency connection, they aren't really obligated to pay attention to you. I used to have groups come in who would be, coming in from California and who would want to talk to Nancy Pelosi, which I could understand. You would want to meet with someone in that office. She's a very powerful person, but she represents a specific district in California. And if you're not from that district, it's not as powerful to communicate with her. So I would very strongly focus on the people who represent you. And if you've got a legislator who represents you, who already supports you on a lot of these issues, you can ask them how you can be helpful in trying to get the support of other legislators. So that's a great question. Then I had the question about how do we know what their political priorities are? So I think we addressed this. Quick question about where the recorded presentation will be available, and it will be available on the CUGH website. So we'll get that link out to you probably in a few days, because we're pairing that with the one on September 15th. Great. Could I explain how to interpret ratings a little more on the votesmart.org site? That's a great question, and let's see if we can go back to that so I can actually show you. All right, so if we go to ratings on the VoteSmart site, you'll see here, let's use something that might not be too controversial, arts, entertainment, and history. So these associations, like the American Library Association, the Americans for the Arts Action Fund, these are all different groups that represent different parts of the arts and entertainment and history community. So, for example, the American Library Association is the Association for Libraries. The National Parks Conservation Association is the association for people who are interested in conserving national parks. And you'll see that they will actually have scorecards that they issue, or that they put forth. They sort of look at the votes throughout a year, throughout a Congress, and say, okay, these are the 5 key 5 key votes that are really interesting to us that we felt that the member of Congress should vote one way or another. And so I'm going to give them a ranking on those votes. I'm going to say, you voted with us correctly, quote unquote, 50% of the time. And so when you see that, that will make you think, oh, okay, well, he or she must be sort of more interested. You can see throughout the years that they do this on an ongoing basis. But you can see, okay, he got 100% with the Americans for the Arts Action Fund. And you can read more about their positions. And you can look at how everyone else tended to vote on it. And it will give you a sense of, again, where they are in the political spectrum, but also where they might stand on your issues. So you can go and look down at, health or the environment or whatever it is that you're going to be particularly focused on. So I hope that helps address that question. And let me just see if there's any more. Okay, good question about what if we have 2 of the most conservative Congress people in the nation, and they will no way change their agenda. So climate change is not something that they're interested in. They are, they are in a different part of the political spectrum from you. So one way you handle that is, first of all, I always want people to go in contact, to continue to talk to legislators who they disagree with, because at least, you're taking up their time. You might think that they're awful, horrible people, but if you go and take up their time, that will give them less time to be doing horrible things to other people. But seriously, another great way to approach that is to make some small asks. So you may know at the beginning, okay, they're not going to agree with me on all of these issues. So instead, I'm going to ask them to come and visit us, or do a video visit with us, or perhaps to see if they'd be willing to be part of a press conference on some new opening at your university or something along those lines. Where it's a very small ask, it's non-political, it's non-partisan, it's just a relationship building ask. And if you start making more and more of those, you might start to find that you've got, you start getting a relationship with that office. Now, if you really feel like that's never going to happen, and you don't like those people, of course, there's registering to vote, which you all need to make sure you do today, as indicated by Dr. Martin's lovely mask with vote across it. But you can also see if you've got other people in your community, in this academic community, who would be willing to contact their legislators, and you can help them with that kind of information to help them get the information that's needed for their legislators. And I think that, let's see if there's others more. How do you identify the swing folks? So that's a great question. The people who might be on the fence about your issues. That can be challenging. I would suggest that you take a look, ask your team to help you take a look at some of the really big issues, the really big votes that are important to your group, and see how the legislators voted on that. Remember, you're going to be focusing on your specific legislators. So you'll have 3 people to look at, the 2 senators and your 1 representative. Now, if you're in a community where you live in one place and you work in another, you might be able to also talk to the legislator who is in the area where you work, because you have a constituency connection there. But that's a good question for, seeing it. That usually depends on the kinds of votes that you're taking. So that would be a good question for your team to sort of figure out who it is that they're focusing on. All right, we'll do a couple other questions here before we move on to step 3. Great question. What if you meet with the aides? Is the process different? The process is not different at all. I always love this question. First of all, people are sometimes frustrated because, I got to meet only with the legislator staff person, not the legislator him or herself. And actually, meeting with the staff is better than meeting with the legislators. And I know people don't believe this, but the staff people are the ones who are really immersed in the issues, and they're the ones that the legislator is going to call when he or she runs down to the floor and asks, hey, how am I supposed to vote on this bill? The staff people are the one that the legislator really relies on. So if you have a good relationship with the staff, and if they have the time to really learn about your issues, it's much better use of your time to be meeting with them. And in terms of knowing something about the office and the legislator, they're sort of like appendages of the staff people. So knowing what committee the legislator's on, knowing what bills he's introduced, knowing about his or her policy positions, that all applies to the staff people as well. The only different thing is pronouns. So instead of saying, Congressman or Congresswoman, will you co-sponsor this bill? You would say to the staff person, will the congressperson co-sponsor this bill? It's sentence syntax and pronouns is the only difference. But thanks for letting me make that point that it's more important to work with the staff people than the legislators. Let's see. So a couple of these I'm actually going to address as we move forward. So I'm going to move on to step 3, which is knowing how to talk to them. So, excuse me. So with step 1 was knowing what you want. So you figured out what you want. Step 2 is knowing who you're talking to. And again, that's a matter of, first of all, knowing who represents you, because you need to make that constituency connection, and then making sure you know their committee assignments, their policy interests, and their political perspective. And now step 3 is, how do you take all this information and develop a winning message? So for those who were on the session last week, you might remember my message to spit, which is totally inappropriate in this time period, and also inappropriate to spit at your legislators ever, but it's an acronym because we have to have a daily dose of acronyms here in Washington, D.C., and it stands for specific, personal, informative, and timely. And so specific is that being specific about what you want and specific about why the legislator would want that. Personal is telling a personal story. So those who were on the call last week sort of got a lot of information about turning your message into a story. And if you didn't, that recording will be available, so have no fear. But that's really about making it personal. You're there to take all the crazy things that happen in Washington, D.C. and translate them to the people that the legislator represents. And I know in the academic community, it can be hard because these sort of anecdotal stories may not feel as scientific as you might like them to feel. You're used to, here's problem A, here's solution B. We did a lot of testing that B is the solution for A. So, Congressperson, you should support that because that just makes sense as a solution. I hate to say this, but logic doesn't always work on Capitol Hill. What does work is making sure that they understand how what they're voting on connects to their constituency. And you do that through a personal, anecdotal, sort of local story. And when I say personal, I don't mean like, you have to tell something about yourself personally, but a local story, the work that you're doing and how it impacts people, how it impacts businesses, even if it's how it impacts your students, how it impacts patients. Just make that sort of more personal connection that's not entirely about facts and figures. And again, that session we did last week really helped explain how to do that. But don't worry, you can fit some facts and figures in there because the I is for informative. So you do want to have that information to sort of back up what you're talking about in the more personal story. But do try your best to make those facts and figures as relevant to the legislator as possible. And what I mean by that is to make sure that you can try and, for the senators, get those facts and figures down to a state level. And for the legislators, for the representatives, try and get those facts and figures down to a district level. So legislators, instead of saying, 4 out of 5 people in America think such and such, they don't care as much about that as they would care about 4 out of 5 people in your state care about such and such. Now, if you can't get that information, if you have it only nationally or even internationally, don't worry, you can still give those facts and figures. But just if you do have that sort of more localized information, that's really, really important to the legislators. And then T is timely, and that's just making sure that you're asking for these things at the appropriate time. We would have people when I was working on the Hill and call and be really outraged at how the congressperson had voted on something. And, we would say, so did you call us about before this vote? And they would say, no, but I'm here to tell you how mad I am. And, our response would be, well, if you told us before the vote about how you felt, we might have been able to do something about it then. which is to say that right now is a perfect time to be communicating with your legislators, whether it's on COVID or climate change. There are so many issues that they're working on as they work through the end of the year funding mechanisms. So you've got it down on timely. And because you're my scientific friends, many of you, your academic friends, I broke it down into a message formula for you. So how can you take everything that we've talked about it and sort of narrow it down into a conversation? I don't want you to sort of take this and just sort of talk robotically through it in any communication with the legislator. It just shows you a way to kind of break it down. So you'd start with, hello, my name is, and I'm from. And that's where you'd say your name and where you're from. So hopefully that you got that. It establishes relevancy. It helps the legislator know that you're from their legislative district or state. Then I am here to talk to you about. Now, a lot of your calls next week and your communications over the course of the year are obviously going to be about the COVID pandemic, but you can also talk about other issues that you might be working on. But you would say, I am here to talk to you about the federal government's role in managing the COVID pandemic. You're not making the ask there necessarily. Then you would say, knowing of your interest in, and that's where I put some information about your audience, I think you'll be interested as well. So if you've looked up the legislator's record and you see that he or she is really interested in veterans issues, you might say, knowing of your interest in veterans issues, I think you'll be interested as well. We have found that COVID, impacts the veterans community disproportionately to the rest of the public. Or I don't know if that's true, by the way. I'm just using that as an example. But that's where you tie in the knowing of your interest in part. Or knowing of your interest in small businesses, I think you'll be interested because I know that, we're all eager to address the pandemic as soon as possible and get small businesses back up on their feet. So then you would say, this is important to the people I represent because, that's where you tell that story. This is important to the people I represent here because I, have students who are interested in moving into the climate change, arena, and, we really make sure that there's adequate funding for those kinds of teaching programs. Or this is really important because the work that we've done on COVID demonstrates that if you, address this one neurological issue, you reduce the possibility of people having a severe COVID response by 25%. Something like that. Don't make it up like I'm making it up right now, but make sure you've got your very specific story in place. But, again, from people from the last week's, you can use that last recording to help you develop that story. Then that's why I really hope that you will. And so you'll say, that's why I really hope that you will. And for example, in our current case, vote for the COVID Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force Act. And then you would say, will you vote for the COVID-19 Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force? And you would put that in the form of a question because then they'd have to say yes or no or I don't know. Usually they'll say something like, well, I'm not sure, I need to learn more about it. And then you'd say, well, let me know your questions and I would like to follow up by, and come up with some follow-up ideas. I'd like to follow up by, conducting a video visit at our campus or conducting a video visit at our lab. I'd like to follow up by having an online town hall on these issues. And I'll talk about some of these follow-up ideas in just a minute. But make sure that you've got an idea for following up before you go in the door, because you will have to follow up. You probably aren't going to go in, ask for something, have them immediately say yes, and then, you can leave and not talk to them for another year. And that's especially true now if you're asking for money. So you might be saying, will you fully fund CDC? And, they'll say, well, I don't know, it's a tough budget year, et cetera. And they're not necessarily just, trying to, be difficult. They honestly don't know. They really do need some more information. And the people who get back to them with the answers are the ones who are far more likely to be influential. I'll say that when I was on the Hill and some people would come to me and say, oh, we want full funding for, I'll use the CDC again as an example. They would come and say, we want full funding for CDC. And if I don't know much about CDC, although obviously people do, but if I don't know much about CDC, I don't know much about what they're doing with the programs, I'd probably say, well, listen, I need to know a little bit more about the program or about the agency before we can agree to fully fund it. And that's where your follow-up comes in, and that's where your relationship comes in. And I know it's frustrating, but I think you probably want to have legislators not just be willing to hand over $6 billion to people because they asked. So that's where the follow-up is important, and that's where that long-term relationship building is important. And then you want to make sure that you get the contact information. And all of this is exactly the same for the staff people. Again, it's just that matter of, sentence structure and pronouns that's different. And it's always great to get the contact information for the staff person, because that's the person who you will definitely be working with in the future. So before I go on to step number 4, I want to take a look at these questions I've got going on. All right. When thinking about health, do you ever want to understand publicly what is known about their family or staff health issues? I would say, you don't want to sort of, stalk them, for lack of a better word, to sort of, go into their history and find something that's not public. But yes, if they have something on their bio, you could say, hey, I saw in your bio that, your family experienced this, or, I saw in your bio that you had a staff person with COVID, or I saw in your bio such and such. As long as you explain what the public forum is that you got the information, that's fine to use. As a DC resident, where does that leave us when it comes to reaching out to representatives? Thank you for that question. I too am a DC resident, and it does frustrate me. So the best way to handle that is to try and see if you've got connections through either your network, through other universities, through the consortium of other people who live in areas where you have legislators who are going to be difficult to get to. So, for example, I live in DC, but my mom lives in California. She's moving to Oregon. 2 states that, given my politics, probably won't be difficult, but I would contact her and I would say, hey, listen, there's this big issue coming up. My DC representative isn't going to be able to vote on it. Do you think you could contact your representatives? I'll give you all the information that you need. That's a great way of trying to handle that. Also, contacting currently Eleanor Holmes Norton as a DC resident. She does, have a role to play at the committee level, and she does have a lot of traction with other members of Congress, so she can go and talk to them, and you can give her the information that she needs to go and talk intelligently on the issues. So someone mentioned last week, we didn't mention the term elevator speech. Do we ever use this term, and how does it differ from what we're talking about? Elevator speech is the perfect term to use. I don't tend to use it because I put these in the context of meetings or phone calls, so they tend to be a little bit longer. But an elevator speech is great. This is more for a meeting because it's a back and forth. For the elevator speech, I use an acronym called WOW, which stands for woo them, wow them, win them. So woo is to capture their attention with something interesting about what you want to say. Did you know that 4 out of 5 people in your district believe such and such? And then wow is to have, really put that in the context of something that happens in Washington, D.C. So 4 out of 5 people in your district think this. Do you know that this bill would impact them in this way? That would be wow. And then win would be, making the ask. So that's why we're really hoping that you'll vote for this particular piece of legislation. For people who I just ran through that very quickly because it's not part of this presentation, it's in the last presentation. So that's in the September 15th presentation, so you'll have access to that. Okay, great question. If they say no, how do we then try to convince them to change to a yes, or just thank them for their time? Again, a great question. So there was a famous politician who said to turn a no to a yes, you need a maybe in between. And that famous politician was from House of Cards. So it's not Thomas Jefferson, it's not Abraham Lincoln, it's the president of House of Cards. And so if they say no, yes, you do want to try and convince them to change to a yes, but not on that particular call. So you would say, okay, great, thanks so much for your time. It looks like we'll have to agree to disagree on this issue. But do you think that you would be willing to, do a video tour of our campus or do an online town hall or, when times are normal again, have a meeting in the district so that we can share with you a little bit more about this. So that's where you make a relationship building ask that they can usually say yes to. They might say no on the policy ask. They'll say yes to that. You build up a relationship over time. And I have seen people turn a no to a yes in that way. So my general advice is to just keep making those relationship building asks and see if you can move it from there. And sometimes they just won't agree with you, and that's what happens. Follow-up ideas are coming up next. My experience with staffers is that they seldom provide their contact information. So that's interesting. I've always found that people in Washington, D.C. do provide their contact information. So in the congressional offices, so I know we can talk about that offline as to what offices you're working with. But when you do call the main number, you can ask for the email address of the person who handles healthcare issues or environmental issues or whatever issues you're talking about. And they'll usually just give you the email address over the phone. If you do have the name of the staff person, I'll let you in on the little secret that the House of Representatives email format is first name dot last name at mail.house.gov. And I'll type that into the chat box near the end so that I can give you all of that. But for the House of Representatives, it's first name dot last name at mail.house.gov. Okay, I got a question here from my congressperson is not running for re-election. Should I have this conversation with his likely replacement? So yes, and yes, you asked only one question there, but I'm going to answer two. One is you should continue to speak with your current congressperson because he or she will be still voting through the end of the year. And there will definitely be votes through the end of the year. And as some of us know, there might be some extremely controversial votes by the end of the year. So still talk to your legislator because they are going to be in a lame duck session and they will be voting on a lot of these issues. But also, if you have an opportunity to talk with the likely replacements, that you know that person and you have an opportunity to touch base with them, then yes, absolutely. Or if you have the opportunity after the election to talk with them, absolutely have this same conversation with them. And it's a great way when they're new to office because you all of a sudden become the institutional knowledge for the office. You become the person that they turn to when they have questions about these policy issues. So it's always good to get in on the ground floor. This may not be connected, but how often do legislators on average get back to constituents who have tried reaching out to them? That is definitely connected. So we find that if you are a constituent of a legislator's office, we can get you a phone call or a meeting when we used to meet in person. We can get something arranged 99% of the time. So it's very often that legislators and their staff will get back to you if you reach out to them. Now, does it take time? Yes. Do you need to be persistent and be personal in your message? Yes. But if you want to have a meeting with the legislator and you keep working at it, you can get a meeting if you are a constituent. Another quick question, and then I want to make sure I have time to move on to the follow-up information. So do emails do anything? Calling on the phone tends to go to email. How do we have a real conversation with folks? So that's a good question. Emails are actually very effective. Most of the staff, spend all day on their computers or on their phones. And so that is often the preferred method for reaching out to staff. They do respond to those. legislators. And if you would like to have a conversation in person or on the phone, are they holding Zoom meetings is another question. Yes, they are. And actually, that's what we're finding for the meetings that we're setting up in the next week. They are holding Zoom meetings. They're doing audio conference calls. So they're doing all the same numbers of meetings and all the same amount of meeting with constituents. They're just doing it virtually. And really, it's just a matter of making sure that you've made a time with them to do it, as opposed to sort of calling up and just trying to chat. All right, let's talk about some of those follow-up ideas, and then I can get to any remaining questions. So the follow-up ideas, you've gone in, you know what you want, you've figured out who you're talking to, you've figured out how to talk to them with your message formula, and now you want to follow up. And because they've said something like, I don't know, I need to learn more, I need more information, etc. So at home, these are some concepts for following up with them. First of all, as we just talked about, online meetings. They are doing Zoom. They are doing, other formats, Start Meeting, Microsoft Teams, all those different formats for meetings. Now, I would suggest that you make sure that the staff can use the platform that you are using, because sometimes the House and Senate have different restrictions on what offices can use, what offices can use as video platforms, because they're concerned about things like, viruses, et cetera, or Zoom bombing has happened. But they are definitely doing those online meetings. As I mentioned, written communications, and by that I mean emails, are very, very effective as long as you follow the criteria that I've talked about. If you're sending an email that's just sort of the basic form letter, then you're probably not going to get a response. That will probably be forwarded to someone, because they receive hundreds of thousands of those form letters and they just can't answer all of them personally. So personalized message will work there. I mentioned video site visits. Those are great whether you want to record them ahead of time and send the recording to the legislator, or even just do something live, where you walk around with your phone and you sort of, or your video camera, and you show them what, as you're walking around, show them all the great stuff you're working on. They like to do those. Online town halls. A lot of legislators are doing town halls through Facebook. They are doing a lot of teletown halls, where a lot of people call into a conference line and you can ask questions. So those are a great way to connect with them. And of course, social media. So I strongly suggest that everyone follow their specific legislators on social media. The big three are Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So follow them on those. And, whenever they're doing something that you approve of, drop them a nice note in the comment section that you can tie back to your issues. So you could say, hey, I saw that you were, working with a small business in the community on, opening back up during the COVID pandemic, and just wanted to let you know we're doing some research on this, and we're really hoping that you will support the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force to look into how minority communities would do that. So you can see how you've made a comment there based on something that they've posted that ties back to what you want, and it's a positive comment. Positive comments get a ton of attention on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, because overwhelmingly the comments are negative. So I suggest putting together a very positive message. You can also ask the legislators to follow you on the social media, and whether it's you personally or your organization, that way they can stay up to speed on what's going on with you. And the legislative offices do that. They do follow people in their district, and they're always excited to see what's going on. So those are some of the follow-up ideas that I wanted to share with you. So those are our 4 ideas: knowing what you want, who you're talking to, how to talk to them, and how to follow up. I know I've given you just a ton of information, so have no fear. This PowerPoint and the recording will be available after the session, and your team will send it out. I do want to address some of the other questions that have come in during this time in our last few moments here. I got about 5 minutes. Let's see, we addressed that one. Let's see, do emails do anything? All right, great, we addressed that one. And we addressed the Zoom meetings. General question: how do politicians view students who are making an ask? And you're asking because students may be inclined to think that their voice is not important. And do we have any advice for students who are getting into this arena for the first time? All great questions. And just thank you so much for asking it, because students are going to be, excuse me, essential to this process. Legislators and staff people like to hear from younger people. They do want to hear how what you're working on or what you're concerned about will impact your future, or how you see it as impacting your future. You have incredibly valuable voices, and I think your legislators and your staff people are definitely going to want to hear that. So I don't know why people would think that their voice is not as important. You're delivering an important message, and even if you're not established yet in your field, you still have something to say, and they represent you, and so they're interested in what you have to say. And getting into the advocacy political arena for the first time, we can talk about that offline. I have just way too many ideas to share in the next 3 minutes. All right, how much time do we get with our legislators, and how many asks on average do we get to make? Great question. So it's usually anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes on a phone call or in a meeting. And that's with legislators or staff people. And for the asks, I would, suggest not cramming too many asks in there. You don't want to say, we want this, and we want this, and we want a pony, and we want, usually 3 to 4 is great. I think, your team has 4 lined up for you. It may have more. And again, you'll be getting that information, but I'm just wanting to use those examples for making the ask. So, that's an appropriate number. I would say probably no more than 4. And if you have a lot of asks, focus in on the ones that are most relevant to you, or the ones that will really, focus on the work that you're doing. So let's say your organization has a huge list of asks. You can say, these 3 are the ones that really impact, our community, but I do want to leave you with the information about the other items that are of importance to the organization. All right, with that, I think that we have gotten to all the questions. Have no fear. Again, I will be available afterwards. I will be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to type my email address into the chat box, and see, someone's giving up personal information. I can't type and speak at the same time. So, all right, there we go. There's my information, and I do have one more question here. Do we advise asking for a meeting with the congressperson's aide or with the congressperson? So for the initial ask, frankly, when it boils down to it, I would ask for the congressperson's aide. They're more knowledgeable about the issues. They're more valuable because they will be able to get information to the congressperson, and they'll generally have more time to do it, and they're much easier to schedule. If you feel like you really, really want to meet with the congressperson, then you have to go through a process with their schedulers. But my advice is to meet with the congressperson's aide. Definitely much more valuable use of your time. All right, I think with that, we've answered all the questions. So Keith, I don't know if you want to come back and send all of our folks off into the world to do some advocacy.
Wonderful. Stephanie, that was spectacular. Thank you so much for doing that. That was Stephanie Vance from Advocacy Associates. Her presentation will be on the CUGH website in the next few days, cugh.org. Please take a look at it. It's also our new website, so you'll see lots of material of what we're working on. And Stephanie gave us a wonderful 1 hour on what to do, how to communicate, how to engage. The important thing is that we all get up and do that, to use the tools that she has to engage our elected officials at all levels of government, and also importantly, to engage the public, to inform the public about the work that you're doing and the things that we're all fighting for. So in closing, again, Stephanie Vance, thank you very much from Advocacy Associates for running this program. I'd also like to thank Monica Gilsands on our team here at CUGH for her wonderful work in helping to put this together. And finally, for all of you out there, please remember to exercise your right and vote. And vote all up and down a ballot when you have a chance to. It's your power. Please exercise it. I'm Keith Martin at CUGH. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we will see you soon. Bye for now.